Alright guys, welcome back to Learnlyte. In this video, we're going to continue where we left off from the last video in which we talked about functions. So, in this video, I want to talk about function parameters and arguments. So what are function parameters and arguments? So remember, in the last video, I had written a function called hello, which basically accepted a name. And then what we did was to display to the user a statement that says, hello, my name is, and then we simply added on the name. Alright, so in this example we can see here that function accepts a parameter called name, and basically what we did was print to the user, hello, my name is, and we added on the name that we got right here. And that's what a function parameter or argument is. It's basically something that we define here between the brackets, and that's something the function needs to have in order to run. So let's see it in action. If I hit run module, save, and I call name, you're gonna ask me for a name and I give it John, close bracket, hit enter, it says my name is John. So what happens if I call hello without giving it an argument or a parameter, and I go ahead and just hit enter? It's going to say the hello function missing one required positional argument name. So what that means is for the hello function to run, we need to supply it with a name or an argument known as name. And that's what function parameters and arguments are. They are things that we define that says, hey Python, in order for this function to run, we need to provide it with this and this, right? And without it, we can't execute the function. Let's look at another example. I'm going to create another function called twice. And in this example, I'm going to have it accept a parameter or argument called z. Arguments can have any name that we want it to. And basically what we're going to do is going to print z 2 times. Alright. We're gonna hit run, hit OK, and then when we call twice, we're gonna give it any argument we want, such as 78. Go ahead and enter. We get 78 2 times. So we can call twice, and as I said, we can pass any argument we want. In this case, I'm gonna pass a string that says hello. Go ahead and enter, and it prints hello 2 times. So in this case, our argument z, or parameter z, can be anything that we want, because all it's doing is just going to display z 2 times. In this example, in our hello function, name has to be a string. And the reason for that is because right here, we have this string here, and what we're doing is we're adding name to that string. So the only operation on string that we can perform addition on is basically when we add 2 strings together, which is basically a way for us to concatenate strings. It's a way of combining strings together. So if name were anything else other than a string, would get a error. And instead of talking about it, let me show you it in action. So I'm gonna come down here. I'm gonna call the function hello, and I'm pass a value of 5 into it. I go ahead and hit enter, and it says type error, must be string, not int. And what that means is that the parameter name must be a string. If it were anything else, we're going to be trying to add something that is not a string to a string, and that's going to throw us a error. But in this case, for twice, since all we're doing is printing the value of z, z can be anything that we want. Let's look at another example. In this example, I'm going to define a function called sum, and sum is going to accept 2 parameters, or 2 arguments, num1 and num2. And basically, I'm going to create a variable inside sum, a variable called x. And I'm going to assign it a value of num1 plus num2. And then I'm just going to return x. Alright. Let's see this one in action. Hit OK to save. I'm going to call sum. Whoops. I forgot sum is a Python built-in function, I believe. but we should be able to continue. 4 and 9, and we get 13. Let's call this my sum. Run module. I'm going to call this function my sum, which takes num1 and num2 again. So we're going to say 7, 8. Go ahead and hit enter, and we get 15. Alright, so in my sum, we can see it accepts two arguments, num1 and num2, and in this case, num1 is equal to 7, and num2 is equal to 8. And then x is assigned the value of num1 plus num2, which is 7 plus 8. And then what we're doing is returning x, so we're returning 7 plus 8, which is 15. Alright? So that means my sum accepts two parameters, so in order for it to run, it needs both of them. If you supply only one, it will throw an error, and you can see right here, if we call my sum, and let's say I only give it 5, you see it throws an error. My sum missing one required positional argument num2, because we only supplied num1. So you should also take note that when we're supplying multiple parameters or arguments, we separate them by the comma. Let's do another example. In this case, I'm going to create a function called multiply, and this one is going to accept three parameters, num1, num2, and num3. Then I'm going to create a variable called mul and assign it a value of num1 times num2 times num3, and then I'm just going to return this value mul. Alright, save and hit run. Invalid syntax. Oh, I spelled return wrong. Return. Go ahead and hit run. Hit OK. And then when we call multiply, we need to give it three arguments. So 2, 3, and 4. And the value we get is 24. Now that makes sense, right? Because here num1 is equal to 2, num2 is equal to 3, and num3 is equal to 4. And we assign a value of num1 times num2 times num3 to the variable mul. So mul is going to be equal to 2 times 3 times 4, which we know is 24. Alright. So that's it for parameters, function parameters. The next thing that I want to talk about are variables. And more specifically, I want to talk about variable scopes. So there are two types of variable scopes. We have local variables and we have global variables. So what are local variables? Local variables are variables that we define inside a function. So an example is x is a local variable and mul is a local variable. So the key thing to note about local variables is that local variables can only be accessed or be used by the function in which they are defined. So what that means is only my sum can use the variable x, and only multiply can use the variable mul, right? So that means if we try to use mul in my sum, we're gonna get an error because it's not defined in my sum. And vice versa, if we try to use x in multiply, the variable x in multiply, we're gonna get an error because x is not defined in multiply. And that is known as a local variable. So remember, local variables are variables that are defined inside a function, and only that function can use that variable. The next type of variable are called global variables. Global variables are kind of the opposite to local variables. They can be used by any function within the Python script. So let's take a look at it. So up here, I'm going to create a global variable called bin call. I'm going to set this to true. I'm going to create another variable called integer, and set that equal to 5. So what that means is now, since these variables are defined outside of any function, they are known as global variables. And all function, hello, twice, my sum, and multiply, and every other function in the script would have access to these variables. So let's create another function called example, and this one won't accept any arguments, because remember, functions can accept arguments or they cannot accept any arguments. And what I mean by that is, since example does not accept any arguments, it doesn't need any arguments in order to run, or any parameters. So in this function, all I'm going to do is print bin underscore called. So even though bin call, the variable bin call, has not been defined in example, because it's been defined as a global variable, example will have access to bin called. So I go ahead and save, and I run, and I call the example function. Doesn't need any arguments. I hit enter, and I get true. So as you can see here, example have access to bin called. Alright, here in this function multiply, you can see we're returning mul, but I want to change it up a bit, and instead of returning mul, I want to return mul plus integer. Alright, so as you can see here, remember, mul is basically the value of num1, num2, and num3 multiplied by each other. And right here, instead of returning just mul, I'm going to return mul plus the integer variable, which we define up here to be 5. So let's run this example. Go ahead, save. I'm going to call the multiply function. I'm going to pass a value of 1, 1, and 1. So what that means is that num1 is 1, num2 is 1, and num3 is 1. Hit enter, and I get a value of 6. So how do I get a value of 6? Remember, 1 times 1 times 1 is just 1, and 1 plus the integer, which is up here, defined to be 5, is going to give us 6. So as you can see, all functions have access to these global variables. But remember, for local variables such as x and mul, only the function in which they are defined have access to them. So as you can imagine, since x was not defined in multiply, multiply does not have access to the variable x. And we can see that in action, because if I replace integer with x, we're going to get an error when we run it again. And you will see that error shortly. So multiply, I'm going to pass a value of 1 again, and 1, and 1. Close bracket, hit enter, we get an error. Name x is not defined, right? It's defined in my sum, but it's not defined in multiply. Hence, multiply does not have access to the variable x and thus cannot use it. We would have to define x inside multiply in order to use it. Alright, and that's it for variables, both local and global. The last thing that I want to talk about in this video is functions. That's void functions and what I like to call fruitful functions. So what are void functions? Void functions are functions that basically perform an action but doesn't return any value, right? And what that means is that since it doesn't return any value, it means that we have no value to basically work with. So an example of a void function is this right here. Hello basically just displays to the user this statement. It doesn't return any value of any sort. So if we were to basically call this function and try to figure out the type of the return, we would basically get none. And we can see that in action. I want to close this. I want to rerun this again so I can get a clear screen. I'm going to write the type function. Instead of this, I'm going to call the hello function. And since hello does not return anything to the user, doesn't return an actual value, we expect a type of none. And if we hit enter, of course, hello requires an argument in order to run. We've been through this. So type hello, need a name John, close bracket, hit enter, we get a class none type. What that means is that hello does an action, but it doesn't return anything. And since it doesn't return anything, what the type of the function is basically a none type, because it doesn't return any value. And similarly, it's going to be the same case for type twice, which needs an argument. And the argument is going to be 45. And then I'm going to close bracket, and we get none type. So it does an action, but it doesn't return anything, and hence these functions are called void functions, right? They're a function that does an action but doesn't return any actual value. The next type of function that I want to talk about are called fruitful functions. Fruitful functions are a function that has a return type. So basically these functions usually perform an operation and then return some kind of value, right? So what that means is that it does some type of operation and then it returns something to us that we can then use in another function or use it to perform some other computation. An example is this function right here, mySum, in which case we add two numbers and then we return the value of x, right? So if we were to call this function my underscore sum, if I were to call type, and then instead of it I'm going to write my underscore sum, and I pass two values 4 and 5, and then I close it and I hit enter, we get a class of integer. What that means is that it adds the two numbers and returns the value of x, and the value of x that is being returned is of type integer. And in this case I'm going to call my sum, I'm going to say 6 and 7, and then I hit enter, we get 13. What that means is that the value 13 is returned to us. And when we find the type of 13, we get integer. So this is a fruitful function because it's actually returning something to the user. I can call this function again, called mySum. In this case, num1 is going to be 5.6, and then 5.6, and num2 is going to be 9.2. Gonna hit enter, and we get 14.79, which is a float. This is a value that's being returned to us. I'm going to do one more example, and this is going to be def example 2. So in this case, I want to do something. I want to show you a key difference between print and return. So print, I'm just going to print hello. So this isn't returning anything, it's just displaying to the user hello. So when I hit run, right, and I call example 2, all it does, it just display to the user hello. It's not actually returning anything. So because it's not returning anything, this is a void function. And you can see that if I use a keyword, the built-in Python function type, and I pass example 2 to it, and I hit enter, I get hello, but I get a class of none type. And the reason why I get a class of none type is because example 2 function is not returning anything to the user. And since it's not returning anything to the user, its type is a none type, which means that it is a void function. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to change it from print to return. So now I'm not only displaying something to the user, I'm actually returning a value, and the value that I'm returning is a string called hello. So if I were to run, I hit OK, and I call example 2 again, I hit enter, you can see I get hello, right? That's good. So if I were to use the Python built-in function type, I call example 2 again, and hit enter, I get a class of string, whereas before I got a class of none. So right here, because I'm actually returning the value of hello, which is a string, I actually get a class string. And this is known as a fruitful function. So when you want a fruitful function, you basically use the return keyword to return that value. So when the function gets executed, that value gets returned, and then we can use that value in another function or to perform some other computation. Alright, that's it for this video. In the next video, we're going to look at some examples, and we're going to try to solve some problems using functions and everything that we've learned thus far. As always, I want to thank you for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe for more content. And always, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section below. And I'll see you in the next video. So thank you for watching.